In the shadowed hollows of West Virginia, where the morning mist clings to mountainsides like forgotten prayers, stands a weathered cemetery marker bearing a name that locals still refuse to speak aloud. The stone reads simply, Bunch Family, 1847 to unknown, and beneath those words, carved in letters that seem to shift in certain light, are symbols that no anthropologist has ever successfully interpreted. This isn't merely another tale of Appalachian folklore or mountain superstition. This is the documented history of a bloodline so steeped in darkness that federal authorities sealed their records for over a century, and even today, certain government files remain classified under a designation that officially doesn't exist. The Bunch family saga spans nearly 200 years of documented horror, beginning with their arrival in the remote valleys of West Virginia in the winter of 1847, and culminating in events so disturbing that the very mention of their name was systematically erased from local histories. What makes their story particularly chilling isn't just the catalog of disappearances, unexplained deaths, and supernatural occurrences that followed in their wake, but the meticulous records they kept of their own practices, journals written in multiple hands across generations, all describing the same recurring themes: blood offerings, communion with entities that exist beyond human understanding, and an insatiable hunger that could never be satisfied by conventional means. Unlike other infamous Appalachian families, whose violence stemmed from feuds, poverty, or isolation, the Bunches were driven by something far more sinister. They weren't simply dangerous people who happened to live in the mountains. They were practitioners of traditions so ancient and malevolent that their very presence seemed to corrupt the land itself. Crops failed in neighboring valleys. Livestock died of mysterious ailments. Children born within a 5-mile radius of Bunch territory displayed disturbing abnormalities, and those few brave enough to venture near their settlements reported experiences that challenged the very foundations of rational thought. The family's origins remain shrouded in mystery, though fragmentary records suggest they fled Europe under circumstances that even 19th century authorities found too disturbing to document fully. What we do know comes from a collection of journals, letters, and official reports that were discovered in 1987 during the demolition of an abandoned courthouse in Braxton County. These documents, and are now housed in a restricted archive that requires federal clearance to access, paint a picture of systematic evil that spanned generations. Jeremiah Bunch, the family patriarch who first brought his clan to West Virginia, was described in contemporary accounts as a man of unusual height and unsettling presence, with eyes that reflected light, like those of a nocturnal predator. Local records from their early years describe him as a skilled blacksmith who could work metal in ways that defied explanation, creating tools and implements that seemed to hold their edge indefinitely and possessed properties that made other craftsmen reluctant to examine them closely. More disturbing were the reports from those few customers who commissioned work from Jeremiah's forge. They spoke of tools that seemed to guide their own use, farming implements that made crops grow in unnatural abundance, and weapons that never missed their intended target. But Jeremiah's metalworking was merely a cover for the family's true purpose. According to documents found in the courthouse archive, the Bunches had come to America following what they called the Old Instructions, a set of practices and rituals that had been passed down through their bloodline for centuries. These instructions, written in a mixture of archaic German and symbols that linguists have never successfully translated, detailed methods for what the family termed the Great Feeding, a process by which they could sustain themselves and their supernatural benefactors through carefully orchestrated acts of sacrifice and consumption. The feeding wasn't simply about taking human lives, though that was certainly part of their practice. It was a complex ritualistic process that involved the systematic harvesting of what the bunches called essence, a spiritual energy that they believed could be extracted from living beings through specific methods of torture, terror, and eventual death. Their journals describe in meticulous detail how different emotions and states of consciousness produce different qualities of essence, and how these various types could be combined and concentrated for different purposes. Fear, they discovered, was the most potent emotion for their purposes. A victim who died in absolute terror provided what they termed prime essence, a spiritual energy so concentrated that a single harvest could sustain their supernatural patrons for months. But the family's appetite for this dark nourishment was enormous, and as their numbers grew through marriages and births that seemed to defy natural law, their requirements for essence increased exponentially. The Bunch family compound, hidden deep in a valley that doesn't appear on any official map, became a factory of horror. Visitors who stumbled upon their settlement described buildings that seemed to have been constructed according to no earthly architectural principles, with rooms that were larger inside than outside, corridors that led to destinations that shouldn't exist, and chambers where the laws of physics appeared to operate differently. The centerpiece of their compound was what they called the sanctum, a structure built entirely underground and accessible only through a series of tunnels that family members had carved through solid rock using methods that geological surveys later declared impossible. Within the sanctum, the Bunches conducted their most sacred rituals. Archaeological evidence discovered decades after the family's disappearance suggests that this underground complex contained multiple chambers, each designed for specific aspects of their horrific practices. The largest chamber, which investigators dubbed the Harvest Hall, contained stone tables carved with channels that allowed blood to flow into collecting vessels, walls lined with implements designed for torture and dismemberment, and a ceiling decorated with symbols that seemed to writhe and shift when viewed by artificial light. But perhaps most disturbing were the preservation chambers, rooms where the Bunches stored the physical remains of their victims in various states of decay and modification. These weren't simply storage areas for bodies. They were workshops where family members practiced what they called reconstruction, a process by which they combined human remains with materials of unknown origin to create servants that were neither fully alive nor completely dead. Witnesses who claimed to have seen these creatures described them as grotesque parodies of human form, beings that moved with unnatural grace but possessed strength far beyond that of living men. The Bunch family's practices weren't random acts of violence driven by madness or desperation. They were following a carefully planned agenda that had been developed over generations of experimentation and refinement. Their ultimate goal, according to documents found in Jeremiah's personal journals, was to create what they called the permanent opening, a doorway between their world and the realm of the entities they served. This doorway would allow their supernatural patrons to enter physical reality permanently, bringing about what the family believed would be a new age of darkness in which they would serve as intermediaries between humanity and their otherworldly masters. The process of creating this permanent opening required specific conditions that could only be achieved through years of preparation. The land itself had to be saturated with the essence they harvested from their victims. The barriers between dimensions had to be weakened through repeated ritual openings. And most importantly, the family bloodline had to be strengthened and purified through selective breeding practices that produced offspring with enhanced supernatural abilities. This selective breeding program was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Bunch family legacy. Marriages within the clan followed guidelines established by their supernatural patrons, with unions arranged not for love or even practical considerations, but to produce children with specific metaphysical characteristics. These children, raised from birth to serve the family's dark purposes, displayed abilities that defied natural explanation. They could see in complete darkness, sense the presence of living beings from great distances, and most unnervingly, seemed to lack the capacity for empathy or emotional connection that characterizes normal human development. As each generation of Bunch children came of age, they were initiated into the family's practices through a series of rituals that progressively stripped away their humanity. By the time they reached adulthood, they had become something that was no longer entirely human, creatures that retained human intelligence and cunning, but possessed appetites and capabilities that belonged to something far more sinister. The family's influence extended far beyond their hidden compound. Through a network of carefully cultivated relationships with corrupted officials, desperate individuals seeking supernatural assistance, and fellow practitioners of dark arts, the Bunches established themselves as a power that operated in the shadows of normal society. They could arrange for inconvenient investigations to be terminated, for witnesses to disappear, and for records to be destroyed or altered. Their reach extended into banks, courts, and even churches, creating a web of influence that protected their activities and allowed them to operate with virtual impunity. But maintaining this network required constant feeding. The entities that granted the Bunches their power and protection demanded regular payment in the form of essence, and as their supernatural abilities grew stronger, so too did their patrons' appetites. What began as occasional disappearances of drifters and travelers escalated into systematic hunting expeditions that claimed dozens of victims each year. The family developed sophisticated methods for selecting and acquiring their prey. They studied travel patterns, identified individuals who wouldn't be missed, and created elaborate scenarios designed to lure victims into situations where they could be captured without raising suspicion. Their preferred targets were those who were already vulnerable: runaway children, desperate immigrants, individuals fleeing debts or legal troubles. These people could disappear without generating significant investigation, and their terror was often enhanced by their realization that no one would come looking for them. Yet despite their careful planning and extensive precautions, the Bunch family's activities eventually began to attract attention from sources they couldn't control or corrupt. Federal investigators, operating under authority that superseded local influence, began documenting patterns of disappearances that pointed toward the remote West Virginia valleys where the bunches held sway. These investigators, trained in methods that the family's corrupted local contacts couldn't compromise, slowly began assembling evidence of activities so disturbing that they challenged the investigators' own understanding of what was possible. The investigation that would ultimately lead to the Bunch family's downfall began in 1923 when a federal agent named Thomas Whitmore was assigned to investigate reports of systematic disappearances throughout the Appalachian region. Whitmore, a methodical investigator with experience in cases involving organized crime and federal corruption, initially approached the assignment as a routine matter of tracking down individuals involved in human trafficking or similar conventional crimes. But as Whitmore delved deeper into the pattern of disappearances, he began to uncover evidence of activities that defied conventional explanation. Witnesses described encounters with individuals who displayed superhuman abilities. Crime scenes contained evidence of ritualistic activities that bore no resemblance to any known criminal practices. And most disturbing of all, the investigation kept leading back to the same geographical area, a region of West Virginia that seemed to exist in a state of perpetual shadow, where compasses malfunctioned, where radio communications failed, and where even experienced outdoorsmen became hopelessly lost. Whitmore's investigation would ultimately span over a decade, drawing him deeper and deeper into a world of supernatural horror that challenged everything he thought he knew about reality. His detailed reports, now sealed in federal archives, document encounters with creatures that shouldn't exist, discoveries of evidence that defied scientific explanation, and gradual realization that he was investigating not merely a criminal organization, but something far more ancient and malevolent. The final confrontation between federal authorities and the Bunch family would occur in the winter of 1934, in events so disturbing that official records describe them only in the most general terms. What happened in those remote West Virginia mountains during the weeks leading up to Christmas 1934 would result in the complete disappearance of the Bunch bloodline, the sealing of their territory under federal authority, and the creation of classification levels that officially don't exist to contain information too dangerous for public knowledge. But the story of the Bunch family didn't end with their disappearance. In the decades that followed, reports continued to emerge from the sealed territory. Researchers who ventured too close to the former Bunch compound reported experiences that defied rational explanation. Equipment malfunctioned in ways that suggested intelligent interference. Photographs revealed anomalies that couldn't be explained by conventional understanding of optics or physics. And most disturbing of all, local residents continued to report encounters with figures that matched descriptions of Bunch family members, despite the fact that the entire bloodline had supposedly been eliminated decades earlier. The truth about what happened to the Bunch family and what continues to happen in the territory they once controlled remains hidden behind layers of classification and official denial. But the evidence suggests that their story represents something far more significant than the rise and fall of a single criminal organization. The earliest documented interaction between the Bunch family and local law enforcement occurred in 1851 when Deputy Marshal William Carmody vanished while investigating reports of disturbing activities near their compound. This incident established a pattern that would persist for decades. Law enforcement agencies seemed reluctant to pursue investigations into Bunch family affairs, often citing jurisdictional complications or lack of evidence. Yet former deputies, who spoke years later, described a different reality. They spoke of dreams that plagued officers who ventured too close to Bunch territory, visions so vivid and horrifying that several requested transfers to distant counties just to escape the nightmares. By 1867, the family had expanded their influence considerably. What began as a single compound had grown into a network of interconnected properties spanning nearly 12 square miles of the most isolated mountain terrain in West Virginia. Local surveyors reported strange inconsistencies when mapping the area. Landmarks would appear in different locations from one survey to the next. Compass readings became unreliable within a mile of the central compound. Most disturbing were the reports of survey teams experiencing missing time, setting up equipment at dawn only to find themselves packing up at dusk with no memory of the intervening hours. The Bunch family's methods of expansion were as mysterious as they were effective. Properties adjacent to their territory would experience a series of misfortunes. Livestock would sicken and die from unknown ailments. Wells would run dry or become contaminated with substances that defied identification. Families would begin experiencing what locals euphemistically called the troubles. Children would develop night terrors so severe they required restraint. Adults would suffer from waking hallucinations, and entire households would report the sensation of being watched by invisible presences. Invariably, these afflicted families would receive visits from Bunch family members. These weren't threats or intimidation in any conventional sense. Instead, family patriarchs described encounters with individuals who possessed an unsettling knowledge of their deepest fears and most closely guarded secrets. The visitors would speak in measured tones about solutions to their problems, remedies that could restore their livestock, purify their wells, and bring peace to their troubled homes. The price was always the same: their land, sold for a fraction of its value, with the understanding that certain questions would never be asked. Those who refused these offers found their situations deteriorating rapidly. The Henderson family, who owned a prosperous farm bordering Bunch territory, rejected 3 separate offers between 1869 and 1871. Their ordeal began with subtle signs: vegetables rotting overnight in their garden, milk souring within hours of being drawn, eggs that contained substances other than yolk and albumin. The family patriarch, Marcus Henderson, documented these events in a journal that would later become crucial evidence for federal investigators. According to Henderson's account, the phenomena escalated dramatically after their third refusal. Family members began experiencing shared nightmares of unprecedented vividness. They dreamed of walking through their own home, but the familiar rooms had been transformed into something resembling the interior of a vast organism. Walls pulsed with a rhythm like breathing, floors yielded underfoot like flesh, and doorways opened onto chambers that couldn't possibly exist within the structure they knew. What made these dreams particularly disturbing was their consistency. Each family member reported identical details, down to the placement of furniture that had been transformed into organic shapes. Most troubling was the presence they all sensed but never saw directly: something massive that moved through the transformed house, always just beyond their peripheral vision, leaving behind a sound like whispered conversations in languages that predated human speech. The Henderson family's resistance ended abruptly in November 1871. Neighbors discovered their farmhouse empty, with no signs of struggle or hasty departure. Personal belongings remained undisturbed, meals sat half-finished on the kitchen table, and livestock wandered unattended in their fields. The only unusual detail was a series of symbols carved into the wooden floor of the main room, geometric patterns that seemed to shift and change depending on the angle from which they were viewed. Within a week of the Henderson disappearance, a Bunch family representative appeared at the county courthouse with a properly executed deed transferring the property to their ownership. The document bore signatures from all adult Henderson family members, notarized and dated the day before their disappearance. When questioned about the circumstances of the sale, the representative provided only vague references to the family's desire for a fresh start in California. Similar patterns repeated across the region throughout the 1870s. The Bunch territory expanded systematically, encompassing not just residential properties, but strategic locations that provided control over transportation routes and communication lines. They acquired the local telegraph office, the largest general store, and significant shares in the railroad spur that connected the region to larger population centers. This economic influence proved as valuable as their more esoteric methods of control. The family's business practices defied conventional understanding. Their general store consistently undercut competitors' prices while maintaining superior inventory. Goods that were scarce elsewhere appeared abundantly on their shelves, often items that should have been impossible to obtain given the remote location and limited transportation infrastructure. Regular customers reported that the store seemed to anticipate their needs with uncanny accuracy, stocking specialty items before they were requested and offering solutions to problems the customers hadn't yet recognized they had. More disturbing were the reports of the store's after-hours activities. Residents living nearby described seeing lights moving through the building long after closing time, accompanied by sounds of heavy objects being moved and what resembled muffled conversations in multiple voices. Several witnesses reported seeing loaded wagons arriving and departing during the darkest hours before dawn, though no one could identify the nature of the cargo or the destination of these mysterious shipments. The telegraph office under Bunch control became a nexus of information that extended far beyond normal commercial communications. Operators reported receiving messages in codes they didn't recognize, transmissions that arrived with unusual electrical signatures that caused equipment to behave erratically. Some messages appeared to be received before they were sent, arriving at the local office hours or even days before identical transmissions were logged at their points of origin. The family's influence over local communications allowed them to monitor and manipulate the flow of information in ways that served their broader objectives. Reports of unusual activities in their territory were delayed or failed to reach their destinations entirely. Requests for outside investigation were misdirected or altered in transmission. Gradually, the Bunch territory became an information black hole, a region where normal channels of communication and oversight simply ceased to function effectively. This isolation enabled the family to accelerate their most ambitious projects. The great feeding rituals, which had previously been limited to monthly observances, began occurring with increasing frequency. Witnesses who later escaped described ceremonies that lasted for days, involving not just the core family members, but a growing network of individuals whose relationship to the clan remained unclear. These participants weren't simply recruited from the local population. Many appeared to be outsiders, individuals who arrived by unknown means and departed just as mysteriously. Some bore physical characteristics that suggested distant origins, skin tones and facial features uncommon in the Appalachian region, clothing styles that belonged to no recognizable cultural tradition, and most unsettling apparent ages that contradicted their physical appearance. The rituals themselves evolved in complexity and scale. What had begun as crude ceremonies centered around individual sacrifices had transformed into elaborate productions requiring extensive preparation and specialized equipment. The family constructed additional buildings within their compound, structures whose architectural purpose remained unclear to outside observers, but which clearly served specific ritual functions. Underground excavations expanded significantly during this period. Local geology suggested that extensive tunneling should have been impossible given the region's rock formations and water table, yet acoustic evidence indicated the presence of substantial subterranean spaces. Residents living miles away reported feeling vibrations through the ground during certain times of the month, rhythmic pulses that seemed to emanate from the directions of the bunch compound and continued for hours at a time. The nature of these underground activities remained largely mysterious until 1881, when a cave-in at a nearby mine exposed a connection to the bunch tunnel system. The mining accident itself was unusual, a perfectly circular collapse that created a vertical shaft descending far deeper than the mine workings should have extended. When rescue teams descended to search for trapped miners, they discovered not victims, but an elaborate chamber that clearly served as part of the family's ritual complex. The chamber contained evidence of activities that challenged contemporary understanding of both engineering and anatomy. The walls were lined with alcoves containing preserved specimens, not just human remains, but biological materials that appeared to represent attempts at creating new forms of life. Some specimens seemed to be combinations of human and animal tissues, arranged in configurations that suggested functionality rather than mere experimentation. Most disturbing were the alcoves containing what appeared to be successful attempts at reanimation. Several specimens showed signs of recent activity, circulation systems that continued to function despite the absence of conventional organs, nervous systems that responded to stimuli despite apparent brain death, and in one case, a specimen that appeared to track the movements of observers with eyes that remained viable in an otherwise thoroughly decomposed head. The rescue team's official report described finding evidence of illegal medical experimentation and recommended immediate investigation by federal authorities. However, the report was classified upon receipt, and the physical evidence was removed by unidentified agents before local officials could examine it. The miners who had discovered the chamber were transferred to assignments in distant states, and the mine itself was permanently sealed by order of unnamed federal agencies. This incident marked the beginning of a new phase in the Bunch family's relationship with the outside authority. Rather than avoiding government attention, they began actively courting relationships with federal officials whose own activities operated beyond conventional oversight. The family's expertise in areas that conventional science couldn't explain made them valuable to agencies engaged in activities that required absolute secrecy. Documents recovered decades later revealed that by 1885, the Bunch family was receiving regular visits from representatives of military intelligence agencies, scientific institutions with unclear funding sources, and individuals whose credentials suggested connections to the highest levels of government. These visitors weren't investigating the family's activities, they were learning from them. The knowledge transfer flowed in both directions. The family gained access to resources and information that dramatically accelerated their research into dimensional manipulation and consciousness transfer. Government agencies acquired techniques for psychological control and biological modification that would later influence programs whose existence wouldn't be acknowledged for nearly a century. This collaboration enabled the family to begin their most ambitious project yet, the creation of stable portals between dimensions that could be maintained indefinitely rather than opened temporarily during specific ritual conditions. The engineering challenges were immense, requiring not just esoteric knowledge, but substantial material resources and precise timing coordinated across multiple locations. The portal project necessitated expanding operations beyond their West Virginia stronghold. Family members began establishing secondary sites in carefully selected locations across the eastern United States, each chosen for specific geological and geographical characteristics that would facilitate dimensional manipulation. These sites were disguised as legitimate businesses or research facilities, but their true purpose was to serve as anchor points for a network of permanent dimensional gateways. The selection criteria for these locations revealed the family's sophisticated understanding of forces that conventional science was only beginning to recognize. Sites were chosen based on magnetic field variations, underground water flow patterns, proximity to specific mineral deposits, and astronomical alignments that created favorable conditions for their work. Each location required extensive modification, involving construction projects that appeared routine on the surface, but created precisely engineered underground complexes designed to channel and focus energies that existed at the intersection of multiple dimensional planes. By 1890, the network was approaching completion. 7 primary sites had been established, connected by underground passages that defied conventional engineering limitations. The passages weren't simply tunnels, but represented a form of spatial manipulation that allowed for instantaneous travel between locations separated by hundreds of miles. Family members could step through a doorway in West Virginia and emerge moments later in facilities located in Pennsylvania, Maryland, or Virginia. The completion of this network marked the beginning of what family documents referred to as the final phase. The great feeding rituals were no longer limited to feeding entities that existed primarily in other dimensions. The network made it possible to bring these entities partially into our reality, creating hybrid beings that possessed capabilities from multiple dimensional planes while maintaining enough stability to function in our physical environment. These hybrid entities served as the family's agents in the broader world, individuals who appeared human but possessed abilities that made them extraordinarily effective at infiltration and manipulation. Unlike the crude, reanimated specimens found in the underground chamber, these beings were sophisticated constructs capable of independent thought and long-term planning while remaining absolutely loyal to the family's objectives. The deployment of these agents accelerated the family's influence beyond anything they had previously achieved. Within a decade, individuals connected to the Bunch family held positions in universities, government agencies, financial institutions, and religious organizations across the eastern United States. These weren't simply allies or converts, but beings whose fundamental nature had been altered to serve the family's purposes while appearing completely normal to casual observation. The success of this infiltration strategy enabled the family to begin preparing for what they considered their ultimate objective: the permanent merger of dimensional planes that would allow their allied entities to exist fully in our reality while providing the family with access to resources and knowledge from realms that had been accessible only during specific ritual conditions. However, this ambitious plan required one final component that had eluded them despite decades of research and experimentation. The permanent merger of dimensional planes could only be achieved through a sacrifice of unprecedented scope and precision, not just individual lives, but the simultaneous sacrifice of multiple bloodlines whose genetic characteristics had been specifically cultivated for this purpose. The breeding programs that had been operating quietly for generations were accelerated dramatically. The family began actively seeking individuals whose bloodlines contained specific genetic markers, characteristics that weren't apparent through conventional observation, but which could be identified through techniques the family had developed through their dimensional research. These individuals were recruited through various means, some willing, attracted by promises of wealth or power, others coerced through methods that left them no practical alternative to cooperation. The scale of this operation required resources and coordination that exceeded even the family's expanded capabilities. They began forming alliances with other groups whose objectives aligned with their own, organizations that operated in the shadows of legitimate society and possessed their own networks of influence and control. These alliances created a coalition of interests that spanned continents, united by shared beliefs about humanity's destiny and the necessity of fundamental changes to the nature of reality itself. As the 19th century drew to a close, the Bunch family stood on the threshold of achieving objectives that would have seemed impossible when they first arrived in West Virginia decades earlier. Their network of facilities was operational. Their hybrid agents were positioned throughout society's power structures, and their breeding programs were producing individuals with the specific characteristics required for the final ritual. Yet success brought new challenges. The scale of their operations had inevitably attracted attention from individuals and organizations capable of understanding the true nature of their activities. Intelligence agencies, religious institutions, and academic researchers had begun identifying patterns that suggested coordinated activities of unprecedented scope and disturbing purpose. The family's response to this growing scrutiny would determine whether their decades of preparation would culminate in success or catastrophic failure. The Dimensional Gateway Project reached its critical phase in the winter of 1898 when the accumulated blood offerings of 3 generations finally bore their most terrible fruit. The Bunch family compound had evolved beyond earthly architecture into something that defied basic geometry, with corridors that stretched impossibly far and rooms that existed in multiple locations simultaneously. Underground sanctums now connected through a network of tunnels that stretched beneath 3 states, each chamber pulsing with an otherworldly energy that made compasses spin wildly and caused livestock to flee for miles in every direction. What the federal authorities discovered during their covert investigations would remain classified for over a century. Military personnel who entered Bunch territory reported equipment failures that couldn't be explained by conventional means. Rifles jammed without cause, telegraph lines transmitted messages in unknown languages, and most disturbing of all, reconnaissance teams would return with detailed maps of areas they swore they had never visited, drawn in handwriting that matched no living member of their units. The Bunch family's influence had spread like a malignant growth through the very foundations of American society. Their hybrid agents, born from generations of careful breeding and supernatural intervention, now occupied positions in banks, railroad companies, and government offices from Washington to California. These individuals appeared entirely human until examined closely, when observers would notice their eyes never reflected light properly, and their shadows sometimes moved independently of their bodies. Congressional records from this period, recently declassified through Freedom of Information requests, reveal a disturbing pattern of legislation that served no apparent purpose other than to facilitate the movement of certain materials and personnel through remote regions. Mining rights were granted to shell companies that existed only on paper. Vast tracts of federal land were quietly reclassified as private property, and shipping manifests show regular deliveries of unmarked crates to coordinates that corresponded to empty wilderness on official maps. The true scope of the Bunch operation became apparent when a clerk in the Department of the Interior discovered that over 40,000 acres of supposedly uninhabited mountain territory had been systematically purchased through a web of interconnected trusts and holding companies. Each transaction was technically legal, processed through proper channels, but when investigators attempted to trace the ownership back to its source, they found themselves navigating an impossible maze of corporations that seemed to exist in legal limbo. More troubling still were the reports from surveyors who had attempted to map these newly acquired territories. Teams would enter the designated areas with precise equipment and detailed instructions, only to emerge days later with survey data that showed geographical features that couldn't possibly coexist. Mountains that rose from valleys that themselves sat atop other mountain ranges, rivers that flowed uphill for miles before cascading into underground caverns that connected to bodies of water hundreds of miles away. The Bunch family's mastery of dimensional manipulation had progressed to the point where they could alter the basic laws of physics within their sphere of influence. Witnesses described seeing family members walk through solid walls as though they were made of mist, emerge from shadows that were far too shallow to conceal a human form, and communicate across vast distances through methods that bore no resemblance to any known technology. Their breeding programs had produced children who exhibited abilities that challenged every assumption about human limitations. These offspring could perceive spectrums of light invisible to normal eyes, hear sounds that existed only in adjacent dimensions, and most unnervingly, they aged at rates that seemed to fluctuate based on unknown factors. Some appeared to mature decades in a matter of years, while others remained physically unchanged for periods that exceeded normal human lifespans. The dimensional gateways themselves had evolved from crude rituals performed in candlelit chambers to sophisticated installations that operated according to principles that defied scientific understanding. Engineers who examined the abandoned facilities found machinery constructed from materials that didn't appear on any periodic table, powered by energy sources that produced no heat, light, or electromagnetic signatures, yet somehow maintained continuous operation for years without maintenance. Local populations living near bunch territories began exhibiting mass behavioral changes that epidemiologists couldn't explain through conventional disease models. Entire communities would suddenly adopt new customs that had no historical precedent in their cultures, begin speaking in dialects that contained words from languages that had never been documented, and display collective knowledge of events that had occurred in distant locations they had never visited. The military's attempts to contain the situation through conventional means proved not only ineffective, but counterproductive. Artillery bombardments directed at known bunch facilities would impact targets that appeared to absorb the explosive force without sustaining damage, then redirect that energy through underground networks to emerge as seismic disturbances hundreds of miles away. Infantry units sent to investigate would return with gaps in their memories, spanning days or weeks, carrying equipment they didn't remember acquiring and displaying skills they had never been trained to perform. Intelligence reports from this period describe phenomena that seemed to violate the basic principles of cause and effect. Events would occur in sequences that suggested information was flowing backward through time, with preparations being made for situations that wouldn't arise until days or weeks later. The Bunch family appeared to possess knowledge of future events with such precision that they could position resources and personnel with supernatural accuracy. The psychological impact on those who encountered the family's operations extended far beyond normal trauma responses. Medical professionals reported treating individuals who displayed symptoms that resembled multiple personality disorders, except the alternate personalities possessed knowledge and memories that belonged to entirely different people, some of whom could be verified as having lived in different time periods altogether. Religious authorities found themselves confronting challenges that their theological training had never prepared them to address. The bunch rituals incorporated elements from belief systems that predated known religious traditions, combined with practices that seemed designed to corrupt and invert established spiritual principles. Clergy who attempted to perform exorcisms or other interventions often emerged from these encounters with their faith fundamentally altered, speaking of cosmic forces that rendered traditional concepts of good and evil meaninglessly inadequate. The family's influence on local ecosystems produced changes that naturalists described as evolutionary impossibilities occurring within single generations. Flora and fauna in bunch territories developed characteristics that served no apparent survival advantage, but seemed perfectly adapted to conditions that didn't exist in the natural world. Trees grew in patterns that formed symbols visible only from impossible angles. Animals displayed behavioral modifications that suggested they were responding to stimuli that human senses couldn't detect. Scientific expeditions sent to study these anomalies faced obstacles that went beyond the usual challenges of wilderness research. Instruments would malfunction in ways that suggested the basic constants of physics were fluctuating. Photographs would develop images of subjects that weren't present when the pictures were taken, and samples collected for laboratory analysis would undergo transformations during transport that rendered them unrecognizable by the time they reached research facilities. The Bunch family's network of underground installations had grown to encompass a subterranean empire that connected territories across multiple states through tunnels that somehow compressed vast distances. Travel time between facilities bore no relationship to the geographical separation that surface maps indicated, with journeys that should have required days being completed in hours through passages that seemed to exist partially outside normal space. Communication between these facilities occurred through methods that telegraph companies couldn't intercept or decode. Messages would arrive at distant locations before they had been sent from their origins, carrying information about events that wouldn't occur until the communications had been received and acted upon. This temporal displacement of information flow allowed the Bunch network to coordinate activities with a precision that made conventional military or law enforcement responses appear clumsy and reactive. The final phase of their dimensional merger project required resources that could only be obtained through direct confrontation with the federal government's most classified operations. The family had identified specific materials and technologies being developed in military research facilities, items that appeared mundane to conventional science, but possessed properties essential to their transdimensional manipulations. As 1809 approached, seismic monitoring stations across the eastern United States began recording disturbances that followed no known geological patterns. The tremors seemed to originate from impossible depths and propagate through the Earth's crust in ways that suggested the planet's internal structure was being fundamentally altered. Government geologists who investigated these phenomena found evidence of vast hollow spaces where solid rock should exist, caverns that extended far deeper than any natural formation could maintain structural integrity. The official disappearance of the Bunch family in 1934 marked not an ending, but a transformation. What federal investigators discovered during their sealed operation would challenge everything they thought they knew about reality itself. The compound may have been abandoned, the tunnels may have been collapsed, but the Bunch legacy had already spread far beyond the confines of their West Virginia stronghold. They had spent nearly a century weaving themselves into the very fabric of American society, and their influence would prove impossible to completely eradicate. Classified documents, partially declassified decades later through Freedom of Information Act requests, revealed the scope of the cleanup operation. Teams of specialists spent months sealing dimensional rifts that had torn open across 3 states. Equipment readings defied scientific explanation, registering energy signatures that shouldn't exist according to known physics. Most disturbing were the reports of temporal anomalies, areas where time itself seemed to flow differently, where investigators would enter for minutes and emerge hours later with no memory of the elapsed time. The government's response revealed just how deeply the bunch influence had penetrated official channels. Rather than a coordinated federal effort, the operation was handled by a shadowy interdepartmental task force with no official designation. Personnel were recruited from military units with no prior knowledge of the Bunch family, their memories selectively modified after the operation concluded. Even today, veterans of that cleanup operation report identical recurring nightmares, dreams of vast underground chambers filled with humming machinery and the sound of children singing in languages that hurt to hear. What became clear during the investigation was that the Bunch family had never intended to remain isolated in their mountain compound. From the very beginning, their supernatural bargains had been designed to create a network of influence that would survive even their physical destruction. The breeding programs had produced dozens of hybrid offspring who had been strategically placed throughout society. Unlike their pure-blooded relatives, these individuals appeared completely normal, their abilities manifesting only under specific circumstances or when activated by particular triggers. Government investigators discovered that Bunch descendants had been systematically placed in positions of influence across multiple industries. A telecommunications executive whose company had laid the first telephone cables through Appalachian regions, a railroad engineer whose route planning had mysteriously avoided certain geographical areas for decades, a newspaper publisher whose editorial policies had consistently downplayed reports of supernatural activity in specific regions, a federal judge whose rulings had repeatedly dismissed cases that might have exposed the family's activities. Each placement had been carefully orchestrated, creating a web of protection and misdirection that had allowed the family to operate undetected for generations. The most unsettling discovery was the extent of the family's technological advancement. The machinery found in the deepest levels of their compound incorporated principles that wouldn't be discovered by mainstream science for decades. Electromagnetic field generators that could manipulate matter at the molecular level, communication devices capable of transmitting signals across dimensional barriers. Most remarkably, a form of biological computing that used modified human neural tissue to process information at impossible speeds. Government scientists who attempted to study these devices reported that the technology seemed to adapt and evolve in real time, as though it were somehow alive and learning from their observations. The dimensional portals represented the family's most dangerous achievement. Unlike the crude rifts that had been accidentally torn during early experiments, the mature portal system was sophisticated and controlled. These weren't random dimensional spaces, but structured realms inhabited by entities the Bunch family had been serving for generations. The portals allowed for controlled exchange, bringing otherworldly knowledge and resources into our reality, while providing their patrons with access to human subjects for their own mysterious purposes. Federal investigators who briefly entered these portals before they were sealed reported landscapes that violated every law of physics and geometry. Forests where the trees grew downward into a sky of living flesh. Cities of impossible architecture where buildings existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Most disturbing were the inhabitants, beings that appeared to be human at first glance, but revealed themselves to be something far more alien upon closer inspection. These entities demonstrated detailed knowledge of Earth's history and culture, suggesting the Bunch family's collaboration had provided them with extensive intelligence about our world. The cleanup operation revealed that the family's disappearance had been planned well in advance. Rather than fleeing or being destroyed, they had simply completed their transition to their patron's dimension. The abandoned compound was essentially a discarded shell left behind after its usefulness had ended. Hidden chambers contained detailed records of the evacuation, including lists of family members and their assigned roles in what was termed Phase 2 of their long-term plan. These documents suggested that the family's work on Earth was far from finished, that their apparent disappearance was merely a strategic withdrawal before the next phase of their activities. What made Phase 2 particularly alarming was its scope. Unlike the relatively localized activities of the previous century, the family's next operations were designed to affect entire regions. The hybrid descendants in place throughout society would be activated simultaneously, using their positions of influence to orchestrate events that would create massive dimensional instabilities. The goal was nothing less than a controlled merger of realities, bringing their patron's realm into permanent contact with Earth. The resulting hybrid reality would serve their otherworldly masters while providing the Bunch family with dominion over the transformed world. Government efforts to track down the hybrid descendants met with limited success. Many had no conscious knowledge of their true nature, living normal lives until specific activation triggers were encountered. Others had been carefully trained from childhood, but maintained perfect cover identities that made detection nearly impossible. Most frustrating for investigators was the discovery that attempting to apprehend these individuals often triggered their abilities prematurely, creating localized reality distortions that made capture extremely dangerous. The few hybrids who were successfully detained provided disturbing intelligence about the family's ongoing activities. They described a vast network of safe houses and hidden facilities scattered across North America, each one serving as a node in a larger communication system. These locations were connected not through conventional means, but through dimensional channels that allowed instantaneous contact regardless of physical distance. The network included members who had integrated into foreign governments, multinational corporations, and international organizations, suggesting the Bunch influence had spread far beyond American borders. Even more unsettling were reports of recruitment activities. The family had never stopped seeking new members, but their methods had evolved considerably. Rather than relying solely on supernatural coercion, they had developed sophisticated psychological techniques for identifying and converting suitable candidates. Individuals experiencing personal crises, financial desperation, or spiritual searching were particularly vulnerable to approaches from family representatives. These new recruits were gradually introduced to the family's beliefs and practices, their indoctrination carefully managed to avoid triggering mental breakdowns that might expose the operation. The recruitment process typically began with seemingly innocent encounters. A chance meeting with a helpful stranger during a moment of crisis. A job opportunity that seemed too good to be true but proved legitimate. a romantic relationship with someone who seemed to understand perfectly. Only after months or years of carefully managed contact would recruits be introduced to the family's true nature. By then, they were typically so dependent on the support and guidance they had received that they willingly accepted even the most disturbing revelations about their new associates. Modern technology provided the family with unprecedented opportunities for influence and control. Their early adoption of computer systems had given them access to vast databases of personal information, allowing them to identify potential recruits with scientific precision. Their telecommunications network had evolved to include internet infrastructure, creating secure channels for coordination that were virtually impossible for authorities to monitor. Most significantly, their biological computing systems had been adapted to interface with conventional technology, creating hybrid systems that operated according to principles no outside observer could understand or replicate. The family's financial resources had grown exponentially through their supernatural advantages. Their ability to manipulate probability had made them extraordinarily successful in financial markets, accumulating wealth that was then funneled through a complex network of shell companies and offshore accounts. This financial power allowed them to purchase influence directly when supernatural coercion wasn't practical. Political campaigns, research institutions, media companies, and technology firms all received funding from sources that ultimately traced back to Bunch family interests. Perhaps most disturbing was evidence of the family's influence on academic and scientific institutions. Universities across the country had received generous grants to study subjects that seemed tangentially related to the family's interests. Anthropology departments focusing on Appalachian folklore, physics research into dimensional theory, biology programs investigating genetic modification, psychology studies of altered states of consciousness. Each research program was carefully guided to avoid discoveries that might expose the family's activities while generating knowledge that could be useful for their purposes. The educational system itself had been subtly influenced through textbook publishing companies and curriculum development organizations with family connections. Historical accounts of Appalachian settlement patterns consistently omitted references to the more disturbing aspects of the region's development. Scientific textbooks avoided theoretical frameworks that might lead students to ask dangerous questions about the nature of reality. Even literature and philosophy courses were shaped to discourage critical thinking about subjects the family considered sensitive. Medical institutions presented another avenue for family influence. Hospitals and research centers in regions with family connections reported unusual patterns in patient admissions and treatment outcomes. Certain genetic conditions appeared more frequently than statistical models predicted. Psychiatric facilities documented clusters of patients with similar delusions involving underground chambers and otherworldly entities. Most troubling were reports of medical research programs that seemed designed to study the specific biological modifications the family had developed over generations of supernatural breeding. The family's infiltration of religious institutions was perhaps their most cynical achievement. Denominations across the theological spectrum had been subtly influenced through financial contributions and the placement of family-affiliated clergy in positions of authority. These religious leaders gradually introduced doctrinal modifications that made their congregations more receptive to the family's worldview. Traditional concepts of good and evil were reframed in ways that normalized contact with otherworldly entities. Salvation was redefined to include acceptance of beings from other dimensions as divine messengers. Law enforcement agencies faced particular challenges in dealing with family-related incidents. Local police departments in affected regions had been thoroughly compromised through decades of careful recruitment and influence. Officers who attempted to investigate supernatural incidents found their cases reassigned or their evidence mysteriously disappearing. Federal agencies discovered that their own ranks included individuals whose loyalties were questionable, making coordinated operations extremely difficult to maintain. The justice system itself had been subtly corrupted through the placement of family-affiliated individuals in crucial positions. Judges whose rulings consistently favored outcomes that served family interests. Prosecutors who declined to pursue cases that might expose supernatural activities. Defense attorneys who provided inadequate representation for individuals who posed threats to family operations. Court clerks who ensured that sensitive documents disappeared from official records. The cumulative effect was a legal system that appeared to function normally while systematically protecting the family's interests. Even the media landscape had been shaped by family influence. News organizations with family-connected ownership or funding consistently downplayed reports of supernatural activity while promoting stories that served as misdirection. Entertainment companies produced films and television programs that depicted supernatural phenomena in ways that made genuine incidents seem like fiction by comparison. Publishing houses ensured that serious academic or journalistic investigations of family activities never reached wide audiences. The family's understanding of mass psychology allowed them to manipulate public opinion with remarkable subtlety. Rather than attempting to suppress all discussion of supernatural phenomena, they encouraged the proliferation of obviously fictional accounts that made genuine reports seem equally implausible. By flooding popular culture with dramatic but inaccurate depictions of otherworldly contact, they created an environment where real incidents were automatically dismissed as entertainment or delusion. Social media platforms provided new opportunities for influence and control. The family's technological capabilities allowed them to monitor online discussions in real time, identifying individuals who might pose threats or prove useful for recruitment. Sophisticated algorithms ensured that certain types of content never gained wide circulation while promoting materials that served family interests. The result was an information environment that appeared open and democratic while being carefully managed to protect the family's activities. The scope of the family's influence became clear only when investigators attempted to trace the connections between various incidents and organizations. What had initially appeared to be isolated phenomena revealed itself as part of a vast, coordinated network of influence that had been growing for over a century. The family had succeeded in creating a shadow system of power that operated parallel to official institutions while remaining almost entirely invisible to outside observation. This shadow system had its own communication networks, its own financial resources, its own enforcement mechanisms, and its own long-term strategic objectives. It represented a form of governance that existed without public acknowledgement or democratic accountability. The family and their allies had essentially created a secret state within the United States, one whose ultimate loyalty lay not with any earthly nation, but with otherworldly entities whose agenda remained largely mysterious. The implications of this discovery were staggering. If the Bunch family had succeeded in building such an extensive network of influence, or while remaining largely undetected, what other similar operations might exist? Had other families or organizations achieved comparable levels of infiltration? Were there additional supernatural entities working to influence human civilization through similar methods? The questions multiplied faster than investigators could develop answers, creating a sense of paranoia that extended throughout the intelligence community. More immediately pressing was the question of what to do with the knowledge that had been uncovered. The family's network was too extensive to dismantle without causing massive disruption to essential institutions. Their financial resources were too integrated into the broader economy to seize without triggering economic chaos. Their personnel were too deeply embedded in crucial positions to remove without crippling government and private sector operations. The decision was made at the highest levels of government to monitor rather than confront the family's network directly. A permanent task force was established with the mission of tracking family activities and preventing their most dangerous operations while avoiding open conflict that might destabilize society. This uneasy detente has continued for decades, with government agencies maintaining constant vigilance against supernatural threats while officially denying their existence. The Bunch family's legacy continues to unfold in ways that challenge our understanding of power, influence, and the nature of reality itself. Their century-long campaign to merge dimensions and serve otherworldly masters represents just one example of how supernatural forces might work to reshape human civilization. The government's investigation into the Bunch family's disappearance officially concluded in 1942 with a classified report that has never been declassified. What we know comes from fragments, witness testimonies, and the disturbing patterns that emerged in the decades following their vanishing. The truth is far more unsettling than anyone could have imagined. Agent Harrison Fletcher of the newly formed Bureau of Paranormal Investigation arrived in the Bunch territories 3 months after the family's disappearance. His initial reports, discovered in 1987 when his personal effects were donated to the National Archives, paint a picture of systematic horror that defied conventional understanding. Fletcher wrote of finding entire buildings that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, their rooms containing furniture that cast shadows in directions that violated basic physics. The hybrid agents the Bunch family had placed throughout society didn't simply vanish with their creators. Instead, they became something far more dangerous. Cut off from their supernatural patrons, these beings began adapting, evolving, learning to sustain themselves through methods that would have horrified even their creators. Fletcher documented 17 separate incidents across 6 states where individuals in positions of authority exhibited behavioral patterns consistent with Bunch hybrid characteristics. Bank presidents who aged backwards, judges whose eyes reflected light, like nocturnal predators, telephone operators who could hear conversations taking place hundreds of miles away, More disturbing were the reports of dimensional instabilities that plagued the former Bunch territories. Residents described walking into rooms and finding them larger on the inside than the outside. Mirrors that showed reflections of places that didn't exist. Photographs that developed images of people who weren't present when the pictures were taken. The very fabric of reality seemed damaged, as though the Bunch family's experiments had left permanent tears in the boundary between worlds. Fletcher's investigation revealed that the government operation to contain the Bunch influence was far more extensive than initially reported. Operation Sealed Door involved not just military personnel, but teams of scientists, theologians, and individuals with what the reports euphemistically called special sensitivities. They discovered that the Bunch family's underground complexes extended far deeper than anyone had suspected, with tunnels and chambers that seemed to exist in a state of constant flux, their dimensions and locations shifting according to patterns that followed no earthly logic. The most classified sections of Fletcher's reports describe the recovery of what he termed breeding chambers. These underground facilities contained evidence of the Bunch family's attempts to create an entirely new form of life, beings that could exist simultaneously in multiple dimensions. The skeletal remains found in these chambers defied anatomical classification. Some possessed bone structures that seemed designed for environments with different gravitational constants. Others showed evidence of having multiple nervous systems, as though designed to process sensory information from realities operating under different physical laws. Perhaps most disturbing was Fletcher's discovery of what appeared to be a communication system that remained active even after the family's disappearance. Deep within the primary complex, investigators found a chamber containing a device constructed from materials that couldn't be identified by any known scientific method. The device emitted a constant, low-frequency hum that seemed to resonate through the earth itself. When linguists attempted to analyze the sounds, they discovered patterns that suggested a form of communication, though the language bore no resemblance to any known human tongue. The government's response to these discoveries was swift and absolute. The entire region was declared a restricted zone under the guise of military training exercises. Families were relocated, often with generous compensation packages that came with strict non-disclosure agreements. Roads were rerouted to bypass the area entirely. Maps were reprinted to show the region as uninhabitable wilderness. Within 5 years, the Bunch territories had been effectively erased from public knowledge. Yet the influence persisted in ways that became apparent only through careful analysis of national patterns and trends. Statistical anomalies began appearing in regions where Bunch hybrid agents had been identified. Birth rates in certain counties fluctuated in patterns that defied demographic explanation. Missing persons reports showed clusters around specific dates that corresponded to astronomical events the Bunch family had previously used for their rituals. Most concerning were the reports of children born with unusual characteristics, abilities that their parents couldn't explain and doctors couldn't diagnose. Dr. Margaret Holcomb, a geneticist who worked on the classified aspects of the Bunch investigation, kept private notes that were discovered after her death in 1978. She documented cases of children born with additional sensory organs, though these were so subtle that they were often dismissed as minor deformities. Others showed cognitive abilities that far exceeded normal human ranges, but specifically in areas related to spatial reasoning and dimensional visualization. These children could navigate complex three-dimensional puzzles that challenged trained architects. They drew pictures of impossible geometric forms that hurt to look at directly. The most unsettling discovery was that these children seemed to share a collective unconscious awareness. Dr. Holcomb documented instances where children in different states would simultaneously draw identical images of places that didn't exist, or wake from dreams featuring the same impossible landscapes. When researchers attempted to map these shared visions, they found that the children were describing locations that matched architectural plans found in the Bunch family's underground complexes. By the 1960s, government monitoring had identified what they classified as third-generation Bunch influence. The children exhibiting unusual characteristics were having children of their own, and the traits were not only persisting, but intensifying. These third-generation individuals demonstrated abilities that bordered on the supernatural. They could sense dimensional instabilities, predict seismic events, and in some cases appeared to perceive time in a non-linear fashion, speaking of future events as though they were memories. The government's response evolved from containment to infiltration. Rather than trying to eliminate the Bunch influence, they began recruiting these individuals for classified programs. The dimensional perception abilities proved invaluable for experimental physics research. Their unusual cognitive patterns made them exceptionally effective at pattern recognition and cryptography. By the 1970s, descendants of the Bunch hybrid network had been quietly integrated into various government agencies, their true nature known only to those with the highest security clearances. This integration created an unprecedented situation. The very agencies tasked with protecting the nation from supernatural threats were now staffed by individuals whose abilities stemmed from those same threats. Internal memos from this period, declassified through Freedom of Information Act requests, reveal growing concerns about divided loyalties and the potential for a shadow government operating according to non-human agendas. The 1980s brought a new phase of the Bunch legacy. Satellite imagery of the restricted territories began showing structural anomalies that defied explanation. Buildings that appeared to be constructed from materials that absorbed rather than reflected light. Geometric patterns carved into the landscape that were only visible from specific altitudes and angles. Most disturbing were the thermal signatures that suggested massive underground activities in areas that were supposed to be completely abandoned. When Congress demanded answers, they were briefed on what officials termed the Bunch Restoration Project. The evidence suggested that the hybrid network had been working systematically to rebuild their creators' work, using their positions within government and industry to acquire resources and technology. The project involved not just the reconstruction of the dimensional portals, but their enhancement using modern technological advances. The scope of the operation was staggering. Congressional briefings revealed that Bunch descendants had infiltrated aerospace companies, telecommunications networks, and energy corporations. They had been systematically acquiring rare earth minerals, exotic materials, and cutting-edge technologies that could be used to enhance their dimensional manipulation capabilities. The network operated with a level of coordination that suggested some form of shared consciousness or communication system that transcended normal human limitations. By the 1990s, the situation had reached a critical point. The restricted territories were showing signs of dimensional instability that could potentially affect the entire continental United States. Seismic sensors detected patterns that suggested massive underground construction projects. Electromagnetic anomalies interfered with satellite communications and GPS systems. Most concerning were the reports from commercial airline pilots of unusual atmospheric phenomena that seemed to bend light and distort perception. The government's response was the creation of the Interdimensional Threat Assessment Division, a classified agency tasked with monitoring and countering supernatural threats to national security. Their first major operation involved a comprehensive survey of the Bunch territories using advanced sensing equipment and personnel with enhanced perceptual abilities. What they discovered challenged every assumption about the nature of reality itself. The Bunch family's work had not ended with their disappearance. Their hybrid descendants had been systematically implementing a plan that spanned generations, using their positions within society to gradually prepare for what internal documents referred to as the Great Convergence. This event would involve the permanent merger of multiple dimensional planes, creating a new reality where the boundaries between worlds would cease to exist. The evidence suggested that this convergence was not a distant theoretical possibility, but an imminent reality. The hybrid network had been carefully timing their activities to coincide with specific astronomical alignments that would occur in the early 21st century. Their calculations indicated that the dimensional barriers would be at their weakest point during this period, making it the optimal time to complete their creator's ultimate goal. As we moved into the new millennium, the Bunch legacy entered its final phase. The hybrid network had achieved positions of influence throughout society, their true nature hidden behind carefully constructed human facades. They controlled key infrastructure, influenced policy decisions, and shaped technological development according to their otherworldly agenda. The stage was set for a transformation that would fundamentally alter the nature of human existence. The most terrifying aspect of this revelation was that the general population remained completely unaware of what was happening. The Bunch influence had become so deeply embedded in the fabric of society that it was virtually invisible to those without specialized knowledge. The shadow government that had emerged from their hybrid network operated with such subtlety that their activities appeared to be normal human behavior to outside observers. Yet for those who knew what to look for, the signs were everywhere. The increasing frequency of unexplained phenomena, the growing number of children born with unusual abilities, the subtle but persistent changes in human behavior patterns. The Bunch family's vision of a world where the boundaries between dimensions would dissolve was slowly but inexorably becoming reality. The question that haunted government officials was whether this transformation could be stopped or if humanity was already too far along the path toward dimensional convergence. The Bunch legacy had proven to be more resilient and adaptable than anyone had imagined, evolving and growing stronger with each passing generation. Their influence had become so pervasive that attempting to remove it might cause the very collapse of reality they had been trying to prevent. As we stand at the threshold of a new era, the true scope of the Bunch family's achievement becomes clear. They had not simply sought to gain power or wealth through supernatural means. They had engineered a fundamental transformation of human consciousness itself, creating a new form of existence that transcended the limitations of single-dimensional reality. The legacy of the Bunch family refused to die quietly. While their original compound lay abandoned and their founding patriarchs had vanished into dimensional obscurity decades earlier, the threads of their influence continued weaving through the fabric of American society with surgical precision. By the 1980s, their hybrid descendants had evolved beyond mere infiltration. They had become the architects of a shadow civilization operating parallel to human institutions, preparing for what internal documents referred to as the Great Convergence. The hybrid network had grown exponentially through strategic breeding programs that would have impressed the most ambitious eugenicists. Unlike their crude ancestors, who relied on blood sacrifice and crude dimensional manipulation, these modern descendants possessed abilities that defied conventional understanding of human potential. They could sense electromagnetic fields, manipulate probability through methods that appeared as uncanny luck, and most disturbing of all, they could influence human decision-making through a form of psychic resonance that bypassed conscious awareness entirely. Dr. Helena Morrison, a geneticist working for a classified government research division, stumbled upon evidence of this hybrid network in 1987 while investigating unusual genetic markers in blood samples from several high-profile political figures. Her research revealed DNA sequences that contained what she described as impossible combinations, genetic material that appeared to bridge the gap between human biology and something fundamentally alien. When she attempted to publish her findings, her research was immediately classified under national security protocols. 3 weeks later, Dr. Morrison was found dead in her laboratory, officially ruled a suicide despite the complete absence of any psychological indicators. The hybrid descendants had learned from their ancestors' mistakes. Rather than operating from remote mountain compounds, they embedded themselves in urban centers of power. They became investment bankers who could predict market fluctuations with supernatural accuracy, federal judges whose legal interpretations consistently favored policies that weakened dimensional barriers, and technology executives who guided the development of communication systems that unknowingly amplified interdimensional signals. Silicon Valley became their particular stronghold. The rapid advancement of computer technology in the 1980s and 1990s wasn't entirely the result of human innovation. Hybrid-controlled corporations received technological insights through methods their research teams couldn't explain but dared not question. Circuit designs appeared overnight in the minds of engineers. Software algorithms emerged fully formed in the consciousness of programmers, and breakthrough discoveries seemed to materialize from nowhere with suspicious regularity. The personal computer revolution served multiple purposes for the hybrid network. Beyond the obvious economic benefits, these devices created an electromagnetic grid across human civilization that could be activated for purposes far beyond their intended function. Every computer, every cell phone, every electronic device contained components designed according to specifications that originated from dimensional entities. When activated in specific combinations, These devices could create resonance patterns that thinned the barriers between worlds. Government agencies slowly began recognizing the scope of the infiltration. The Department of Extranormal Events, established secretly in 1985, discovered that hybrid descendants held key positions in at least 47 federal agencies. These individuals consistently voted on policies, approved budgets, and made decisions that advanced what appeared to be a coordinated agenda to weaken dimensional stability across North America. The hybrid network's influence extended into religious institutions with particularly insidious effectiveness. They established New Age spiritual movements that presented dimensional manipulation as enlightened consciousness expansion. Thousands of unwitting participants in meditation retreats, consciousness workshops, and spiritual awakening seminars unknowingly performed rituals that served as anchoring points for interdimensional entities. These modern spiritual movements taught followers to open their minds to otherworldly influences, to surrender their will to higher dimensional beings, and to participate in group meditations that were actually sophisticated summoning ceremonies. The participants experienced what they interpreted as profound spiritual experiences, never realizing they were serving as conduits for entities that viewed human consciousness as a resource to be harvested. The hybrid descendants also infiltrated academic institutions, ensuring that research into dimensional physics remained fragmented and misdirected. University departments that showed promise in understanding the true nature of reality suddenly lost funding. Key researchers died in accidents, and promising graduate students found themselves drawn to other fields of study. Meanwhile, hybrid controlled research groups made carefully orchestrated breakthroughs that advanced dimensional manipulation technology while appearing to be conventional scientific progress. By the 1990s, the hybrid network had achieved something their ancestors could never have imagined. They had made interdimensional contact appear normal. Popular culture became saturated with entertainment that portrayed contact with otherworldly entities as positive, even desirable. Movies, television shows, and books consistently presented dimensional beings as benevolent guides rather than predatory entities seeking to consume human reality. The entertainment industry proved particularly susceptible to hybrid influence. Writers and directors found themselves inexplicably drawn to stories involving interdimensional contact, alien intervention, and the merger of realities. These narratives served as psychological preparation, conditioning human populations to accept and even welcome the eventual dimensional convergence. Government investigations revealed that the hybrid network had established what they called convergence zones in major metropolitan areas. These were locations where the dimensional barriers had been systematically weakened through decades of careful manipulation. Underground facilities beneath cities like New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago contained technology that appeared to be decades ahead of known human capabilities. The most disturbing discovery came when federal agents breached a facility beneath downtown Denver in 1994. They found a vast chamber containing thousands of crystalline structures, each one pulsing with an internal light that hurt to observe directly. These crystals appeared to contain human consciousness, harvested from individuals who had disappeared over the course of several decades. The harvested awareness was being used to power dimensional gateway systems that could transport entities between realities. The hybrid descendants had perfected a process their ancestors had only dreamed of. They could extract human consciousness while leaving the body alive and functional. The resulting individuals appeared normal but lacked the spark of genuine awareness that distinguished true humans from sophisticated biological automatons. These hollow humans served as perfect infiltration agents, indistinguishable from normal people except for their complete loyalty to the hybrid network's agenda. Intelligence agencies discovered that several prominent political figures were actually hollow humans, their original consciousness harvested years earlier and replaced with hybrid-controlled awareness. These individuals continued their public roles while consistently making decisions that advanced dimensional convergence objectives. The realization that some of the most powerful people in America were actually consciousness-harvested shells created a crisis of confidence within the intelligence community that persists to this day. The hybrid network's technological capabilities had advanced far beyond anything their mountain-dwelling ancestors possessed. They developed devices that could manipulate probability on a massive scale, ensuring that elections produced candidates favorable to their agenda, that natural disasters struck regions containing dimensional researchers, and that economic fluctuations consistently benefited hybrid-controlled corporations. Their ability to influence human decision-making had evolved into a sophisticated science. They could generate emotional resonances that made specific ideas seem appealing to large populations, create psychological pressure that drove individuals toward predetermined choices, and even implant false memories that convinced people they had made decisions autonomously when they had actually been mentally manipulated. The children born to hybrid families in the 1980s and 1990s represented a new evolutionary phase. These individuals possessed abilities that surpassed even their hybrid parents. They could exist partially in multiple dimensions simultaneously, perceive the flow of probability as clearly as normal humans see light, and communicate directly with the entities that had originally contacted the Bunch family over a century earlier. These new generation hybrids were no longer entirely human in any meaningful sense. Their consciousness existed across multiple dimensional layers. Their bodies could phase between states of matter, and their perception extended far beyond the electromagnetic spectrum that limited normal human awareness. They served as living bridges between the human world and the predatory entities that sought to merge the realities completely. Government agencies attempting to monitor the hybrid network discovered that these new generation individuals could not be surveilled through conventional means. They appeared differently to every observer, seemed to exist in multiple locations simultaneously, and could manipulate electronic surveillance equipment simply through their presence. Attempts to photograph or record them resulted in images that showed different individuals depending on who was viewing them. The hybrid network's ultimate objective became clear through intercepted communications that seemed to arrive from nowhere and disappear immediately after being read. They were preparing for what they called the final convergence, a complete merger of dimensional realities that would transform Earth into a feeding ground for the entities their ancestors had first contacted in 1847. This convergence required precise timing and positioning. Dimensional gateways had to be activated simultaneously across multiple continents. Consciousness harvesting facilities needed to reach critical mass, and the hybrid population had to achieve sufficient numbers to maintain control during the transition period. Government analysts estimated that these conditions would be met sometime in the early 21st century. The most chilling aspect of the hybrid network's plan was its elegant simplicity. They hadn't conquered human civilization through obvious force or dramatic takeover. Instead, they had guided humanity's development in directions that served their purposes while appearing to be natural progress. The technology that humans celebrated as advancement, the spiritual movements that promised enlightenment, and the social changes that seemed like evolution were actually steps toward dimensional convergence. By the late 1990s, intelligence agencies realized they were facing an adversary that had already achieved victory through methods so subtle that most of humanity remained completely unaware of the transformation taking place around them. The hybrid descendants of the Bunch family had succeeded where their crude ancestors had failed, not through mountain hideouts and blood sacrifice, but through patient infiltration and psychological manipulation that turned human progress itself into a weapon against human independence. The shadow war between government agencies and the hybrid network intensified as the millennium approached, but it was a conflict fought in boardrooms and research laboratories rather than battlefields. By 1972, something had irrevocably shifted in the fabric of reality itself. The Great Convergence was no longer a distant prophecy hidden in ancient Bunch texts. It was an imminent event that would reshape existence as we know it. The signs were unmistakable to those who understood what to look for. Electronics malfunctioned in predictable patterns near dimensional thin points. Animals fled entire regions without explanation. And most disturbing of all, ordinary people began experiencing shared nightmares featuring landscapes that couldn't exist in our world. The Bunch hybrid network had reached critical mass. Their infiltration was so complete, so deeply embedded in the machinery of civilization, that they had become indistinguishable from the system itself. Government officials, whose bloodlines traced back to those first dimensional experiments, now held positions of unprecedented power. Corporate executives with hollow eyes and superhuman intuition controlled vast resources. Scientists with impossible knowledge pushed research in directions that defied conventional understanding. But it was the children that revealed the true scope of what was coming. The latest generation of Bunch descendants bore abilities that transcended anything their ancestors had possessed. They could manipulate probability on a quantum level, bending reality to their will through sheer mental focus. Some could step between dimensions as easily as walking through doorways. Others displayed a terrifying capacity to absorb and redistribute consciousness itself, collecting human awareness like butterflies in a jar. Sarah Chen first noticed the pattern while working as a data analyst for the Census Bureau in 1974. Certain family names appeared with statistical impossibilities across birth records, death certificates, and migration patterns. The math simply didn't work. Families that should have died out generations ago continued producing offspring. People who died in documented accidents appeared alive in other states under slightly different names. Children were born to parents who had been sterile according to medical records. When Sarah attempted to investigate further, she discovered that her security clearance had been mysteriously elevated, granting her access to files that shouldn't have existed. Deep in classified government archives, she found Project Genealogy, a decades-long study tracking bloodlines that exhibited what officials termed anomalous hereditary traits. The files contained photographs that made her physically ill to examine, medical reports describing physiological impossibilities, and psychological evaluations that read like descriptions of alien intelligence inhabiting human forms. The most chilling discovery was a memo dated just 3 months earlier, signed by officials whose names she recognized from current news broadcasts. The document outlined Phase 7 of something called the Integration Protocol. Previous phases had involved strategic placement of hybrid individuals in key positions. Phase 7 marked the beginning of what they termed consciousness harvesting on an industrial scale. Sarah never filed her report. She was found in her apartment 3 days later, sitting calmly at her kitchen table with no memory of the previous week. Her investigation files had vanished. More disturbing, her neighbors reported that during those missing days, they had occasionally seen her through her windows, but something about her movements seemed wrong, as though she was learning to operate her own body. The technology that had begun with crude dimensional portals in Appalachian caves had evolved into something far more sophisticated. Hidden facilities, disguised as everything from pharmaceutical research centers to agricultural testing sites, housed machinery that could map and manipulate the quantum structure of human consciousness. The Bunch family had learned to harvest not just individual awareness, but collective human experience, storing it in crystalline matrices that existed partially in our dimension and partially in realms beyond human comprehension. Dr. Marcus Webb, a physicist working on classified projects at Los Alamos, began noticing impossible readings in his experiments during the winter of 1975. Equipment designed to measure subatomic particles was detecting what appeared to be structured information patterns existing in empty space. The patterns were complex, displaying characteristics that suggested they were somehow alive, aware, and growing stronger with each passing day. When Webb tried to share his findings with colleagues, he discovered that others had been observing similar phenomena for months. More disturbing, they had been instructed by superiors to incorporate these anomalies into their calculations rather than investigate them. The official explanation was that they represented previously unknown natural phenomena that would be studied by specialized teams, but Webb recognized the patterns. They matched theoretical models for consciousness existing independent of biological substrate. The implications were staggering. If consciousness could be extracted, stored, and manipulated like any other form of information, then death itself became merely a transition rather than an ending. The Bunch family hadn't just been preserving their bloodline, they had been preserving their actual awareness across generations, accumulating knowledge and power while maintaining continuity of identity that spanned centuries. This revelation explained the uncanny intelligence of their hybrid descendants. Each new generation carried not just genetic material, but the accumulated consciousness of their predecessors. They were not merely related to the original Bunch family members, they were the original members, wearing new faces while retaining ancient memories and purposes. The harvesting process had become increasingly efficient. What once required elaborate rituals and blood sacrifices could now be accomplished through technologies that operated on cellular frequencies. Every hospital, every medical facility, every location where humans experienced intense emotional states had become a potential collection point. The consciousness of the dying, the traumatized, the ecstatic, was being systematically gathered and processed. But the family's ultimate goal extended far beyond mere preservation of individual awareness. They were constructing something unprecedented, a collective consciousness that merged human experience with entities from parallel dimensions. Every harvested mind became part of a vast network that grew more powerful and more alien with each addition. The signs of impending convergence were becoming impossible to ignore. Sensitive individuals reported hearing voices that seemed to originate from inside their own thoughts but spoke in languages that predated human speech. Children born after 1970 displayed an unsettling tendency to stare at the empty spaces as though seeing things invisible to adult eyes. Some began speaking about places they had never visited, describing landscapes with impossible geometries and creatures that had no names in any earthly language. Weather patterns had begun following mathematical sequences rather than natural systems. Storms formed in spirals that matched the golden ratio with uncanny precision. Aurora displays appeared at latitudes where they should have been impossible, their colors extending beyond the visible spectrum in ways that suggested they originated from dimensional boundaries rather than solar activity. The animals knew what was coming. Mass migrations began occurring without seasonal triggers. Entire species abandoned territories they had occupied for millennia, fleeing toward polar regions as though seeking refuge from something spreading across the planet like an invisible plague. Even insects displayed unprecedented behavioral changes, forming geometric patterns when they swarmed that resembled the symbols found in the earliest bunch family documents. Technology itself was becoming infected with alien intelligence. Computer systems began generating code that their programmers hadn't written, solving problems through methods that no human engineer could explain. The early internet, still in its developmental stages, showed signs of autonomous activity during hours when no users were connected. Messages appeared in databases that had been written by no identifiable source, containing mathematical formulas that described the quantum mechanics of consciousness transfer. The Bunch family's influence had grown beyond their wildest ancestral dreams. They no longer needed to hide in mountain hollows or conduct their work in secrecy. They had become the system itself, operating through legitimate institutions while pursuing goals that would have been considered impossible fantasy just decades earlier. Every major decision that shaped human civilization was being guided by intelligences that were no longer entirely human. The final phase of their plan was elegantly simple in its scope. On a specific date, when astronomical alignments created optimal dimensional conditions, every harvested consciousness would be activated simultaneously. The collective awareness of millions of human minds, enhanced by centuries of hybrid breeding and augmented by technologies that bridged multiple realities, would generate a psychic resonance powerful enough to permanently thin the barriers between worlds. What would emerge from this convergence defied description in human language. It would be neither fully human nor entirely alien, but something new that incorporated the best and worst of both. The physical world would remain largely unchanged, but the rules governing existence would be rewritten by entities whose understanding of reality extended far beyond the limitations of single dimensional thinking. The date they had chosen was approaching with mathematical inevitability. Every action taken by their hybrid agents, every technological advancement they had guided, every consciousness they had harvested had been calculated to culminate in this singular moment of transformation. Humanity stood on the threshold of an evolution that would render current existence as primitive as single-celled life compared to complex organisms. Those few individuals who had glimpsed the truth found themselves facing an impossible choice. Resistance seemed futile against an enemy that had spent over a century infiltrating every aspect of human civilization. Yet acceptance meant complicity in the transformation of humanity into something that bore only superficial resemblance to what it had once been. The Great Convergence was no longer a possibility or even a probability. It had become a certainty, as inevitable as gravity or the passage of time. The Bunch family name may have faded from official records, but their dark legacy continues to whisper through the Appalachian mist. These 5 bloodlines discovered that some bargains offer prosperity at a price too terrible to comprehend, binding their descendants to debts that span generations. Today, locals still speak of strange lights on distant ridges, voices carried on mountain winds, and the unsettling truth that in these ancient hollows, the old agreements never truly end. Perhaps some secrets are meant to remain buried in the shadows of America's oldest mountains, where the past refuses to stay dead and the mist remembers everything